wonderful people that contribute to this organization with their gifts and talents. Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I'm joined this morning by Senior Research Analyst Noah Diekemper. Good morning, Noah. How are you?
Good morning, Meg. I'm doing pretty great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we were chatting off air, and I was just trying to get an idea of. It's always interesting to hear the backgrounds of those that aren't born and bred in the Midwest or haven't grown up in Wisconsin. And I know you originally are from your family, I guess, is still in the Maryland area.
Yep. Yeah, pretty close to Annapolis.
Okay. All right. Well, and it's always nice to have. I just am always happy to have anyone from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I always say we need the good guys on our side, and it's comforting, I guess, in a way, to be able to have such great individuals that contribute to defending our freedom and liberty here in Wisconsin and beyond. And I know that you have focused in particular on the redistricting, and we've had many conversations on this show and on the Meg Ellefson show about the maps and all the various terms used, gerrymandering and fair maps and redistricting, whatever the case may be. I know that there was a lot of a lot of concern that if left up to the four leftist members of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, we would have had an even worse lot than what we've been, unfortunately, than what we have with Governor Evers signing the maps into law. So talk a little bit about this proportional representation. I guess start by defining what it is and what you've discovered in your research.
Sure, yeah. So when you talk about redistricting and the drawing of maps, a lot of people often complain about how they are being treated unfairly by the process, and that begs the question what a fair map would look like. And proportional representation is one of the measures that people have come up with to try to identify when maps are fair or not. And it's a very popular measure, even though it has kind of a lot of intrinsic problems with it. But what it tries to say is that if you've got a certain percentage of a state that is voting for one political party, then you should see basically that same percentage or proportion of seats being won by that party in the legislature when a map has been drawn.
So after reviewing what we just recently, and I wish I could remember, is it Act 94? Is that the latest maps that we are now unfortunately facing, I guess, in Wisconsin? Do you believe that they are I'll just use your term, represented proportionally?
So proportional representation is one of the measures like indicating fairness that is often wheeled out by people whose political parties are more concentrated in cities, because proportional representation winds up not really actually describing fairness all that well. So just to give like an example, right? So if you have like 45% of a state voting for one party, they would then say, well, proportional representation means that we should win 45% of the races. But you could, for example, have a state where every household is two families who are voting conservatively and like one child who is voting liberally, and you're never going to be able to draw a map that takes that 33% of the population that's voting liberally and guarantees them even a single like geographic district in the state. So proportional representation kind of misses the mark on what fairness looks like, because it doesn't account at all for where people live in a given area.
So how were these maps drawn, the ones that have been signed into law now?
So the maps are the process was kind of complicated, and there's pretty much been nonstop ongoing litigation for years on the subject. These particular maps that the Wisconsin legislature wound up drawing maps that were made law, and we got to use them for a whole election cycle, and then litigation brought them before the Supreme Court on the claim that they were unconstitutional. And so the maps that we now have for the upcoming election were drawn by, they originated with the governor, and the Wisconsin legislature made a deal where they are the new maps we're working with, so that then we don't wind up with maps that were just drawn by the Supreme Court, which everyone feared were going to be even more deliberately drawn for partisan advantage.
So, how do we get out of this mess, Noah? I mean, it's obviously, I know we're stuck with these maps for now, but I mean, I guess the long or the short message is we need a new governor. But aren't we stuck with these maps now for a significant amount of time?
Well, I think that the hope is that there are going to wind up being more improved maps in the future, but certainly, even just when you consider what effects the maps for 2024 are most likely to have on the makeup of the legislature, we're probably going to have a much more closely divided legislature, because the maps that we've wound up with are pretty drawn to give Democrats an advantage that they wouldn't otherwise have, being as geographically concentrated in Madison and Milwaukee as they are statewide.
So, I mean, ultimately, what you're saying is, I could be putting words in your mouth, but Democrats, they would prefer that there are maps that favor their candidates, and that may or may not be a reflection of the majority of the electorate. I mean, is that a fair assessment of what we're facing at this point?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that every political party is going to want maps that give them some sort of an advantage. And the question is, when people draw out these terms like gerrymandering or fair or unfair, is it actually describing some valid process or not, or are they just complaining because they think they can get a better deal out of it? And gerrymandering there's a lot of research on the subject, and everyone's got a pretty good idea that it involves the manipulation of district boundaries for political gain, or the act of drawing political boundaries to secure extra seats. Those are some lines from the literature. And when you compare it to the actual opposite of gerrymandering, which is district lines that have been drawn at random without reference to partisan advantage, well, you can have a computer do that thousands or tens of thousands of times and get a pretty good picture of what a natural political geography for a state is going to mean for its districts. And the issue with the recent litigation is that notion of fairness was substituted for, well, fair means we have to draw maps that go out of their way to give Democrats an edge, to undo the way that they are concentrated in just a couple of cities.
So, what perplexes me is it kind of shoots their argument when we have had a Republican majority in the legislature for quite a few years, but yet the voters chose a Democrat governor. Weren't the same maps used for both?
So the same maps were used for both, and they would point at that and say that that's an indication of how unfair the maps are, because the the governor, who is Democrat Tony Evers, wound up winning office because you just took the votes of everyone in Wisconsin, counted them up, and he got more than obviously Scott Walker the first time around. And they point to that and say, well, if Democrats are winning statewide elections, then why are we disfavored in the legislature? Proportional representation, we're being treated unfairly because if we're getting like 52% of votes statewide, give or take, then we should be getting 52% of races, right? And again, the problem with that is that the way that the legislature works is that the districts are required by law to be like geographical shapes on a map. The geography, the way that they're drawn, is of concern to our Constitution, and it's not supposed to be just a carbon copy. Same thing, the same kind of an election as the process for governor, where you've got a statewide vote.
So, explain to me. I mean, it doesn't really make sense that that they would make these claims that, despite the fact that Governor Evers won statewide, the Republican districts, or the districts that existed prior to this new maps being signed into law, they were more representative of the individual districts. And I mean, I guess what perplexes me is that I don't know if this maps argument that, well, continues to be an issue will ever be resolved, because it's like a tennis match. It depends on who has control. Well, generally it used to be that it had to do with who has control of the legislature, but in this case, the only way that we can I guess get ourselves out of this is, again, to elect a Republican governor and to have a Republican or a conservative majority on the state Supreme Court.
I think you're absolutely right that one of the weirder things of recent history with maps, because maps have never really not been political in the U.S. The term gerrymander goes back to the guy who was governor of Massachusetts in 1812.
Wow.
It is more novel to have the judiciary taking so much of an active role, and it's ironic, of course, because when you read what the court has said about itself in the recent proceedings, they were insisting that, well, as the court, as the judicial branch, it is imperative that we be politically neutral, that we not favor or disfavor a party. But then, of course, ironically, the experts that they had retained to comment on the different maps that had been submitted by parties just kind of hollowed out what fairness or politically neutral means in this occasion, and said, well, like, fairness or being neutral means that you need to pick the maps that are specifically drawn to help out Democrats and to counteract the natural political geography of the state, which would disadvantage them otherwise. It's very strange.
Yeah, does any state get it right, Noah?
That's a good question. There's a lot of states. I'm familiar with a bunch of states that get it wrong, for sure. There have been some. I've heard some good things about the way that maps were drawn in Iowa, although I haven't done a deep dive on that model as much. Yeah.
Well, Noah Diekemper, thank you for joining me from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. If our listeners want to read more about your research on will-law.org, is there a certain link that they should click on your website to read about, I guess what you have researched?
We've got a couple of different projects on proportional representation and on redistricting in general, but if you navigate to our website, it should be under the policy work that we've done. So
okay.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me this morning. I appreciate it. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you. You as well, Meg.
Thank you. Going to a break. We'll be right back on the WSAU Wisconsin Morning News.